In 1989, a 14-year-old girl named Rachel Holloway walked into the McDowell County Sheriff's Office in Welch, West Virginia, carrying a shoebox filled with confession that would start a chain of events darker than anyone expected. She told Deputy Vernon Kessler that her older sister had been selling her to men for 3 years. What the deputy didn't know was that Rachel's sister, 22-year-old Evangeline, was waiting in a car outside, and that this confession was part of a plan far more twisted than anyone could imagine. Rachel Holloway was born in 1975 in a valley outside Welch, the youngest of 3 children. Her father, Thomas, worked sometimes in the coal mines when his back allowed it, which became less frequent as the years passed. Her mother, Dolores, died from pneumonia when Rachel was 4 years old, leaving Thomas to raise 3 children alone in a 2-bedroom house that seemed to shrink as they grew. Evangeline was 8 years older than Rachel, practically a different generation in the compressed timeline of Appalachian poverty. She had her mother's dark hair and sharp features along with a hardness that settled into her eyes after Dolores died. Their brother Curtis fell somewhere between them in age and temperament, quiet and withdrawn, disappearing for days at a time once he turned 16. Thomas did his best in those early years. He made breakfast before school, helped with homework when he understood it, attended parent-teacher conferences when the school remembered to send notices. But grief and constant pain have a way of wearing down good intentions. By the time Rachel entered 3rd grade, Thomas spent most evenings in his recliner with a bottle, his back brace thrown on the floor, his attention fixed on whatever flickered across the television screen. Evangeline took over the household duties. She cooked meals from donated food boxes, washed clothes in the bathtub when the washing machine broke, kept Rachel's hair braided, and her lunch packed. To neighbors and the occasional social worker who checked on the family after Dolores' death, Evangeline appeared to be a responsible young woman, stepping up during difficult circumstances. What nobody saw was the anger building inside Evangeline like water behind a dam. She watched her friends leave for college or marry young and move away while she stayed trapped in that valley, caring for a father who barely acknowledged her existence, and a little sister who represented everything she'd sacrificed. Rachel would sit at the kitchen table doing homework while Evangeline scrubbed pots. And sometimes Evangeline would stare at her sister with an expression that made Rachel look away, though she couldn't explain why it frightened her. The first sign of what was coming occurred in the spring of 1986 when Rachel was 11 years old. Evangeline started bringing men to the house, always when Thomas was passed out in his chair or working a night shift at the mine. These weren't boyfriends in any normal sense. They were older 40 or 50, driving trucks with out-of-state plates. They never stayed long, maybe an hour, and they always left cash on the kitchen counter before leaving. Rachel learned to recognize the pattern. Evangeline would send her to bed early on certain nights, always with the same explanation that she was tired and needed rest for school tomorrow. Rachel would lie in the bedroom they shared, listening to unfamiliar voices downstairs, the creak of floorboards, her father snoring from the living room cutting through the murmur of conversation. She asked once what the men wanted. Evangeline was washing dishes at the sink, her hands moving in mechanical circles through the soapy water. She didn't turn around when she answered that they were friends helping with bills, that grown-up business didn't concern little girls, that questions like that made people angry. The tone carried a warning that Rachel understood instinctively. She never asked again. The change happened gradually, so subtle that Rachel couldn't identify the exact moment when Evangeline's visitors stopped being a curiosity and became something that made her stomach twist. It started with Evangeline telling her to come downstairs and say hello, to be polite to the guests who were helping keep food on the table. Rachel would stand in the doorway in her nightgown while men she'd never met looked at her with expressions she had no way to understand. One man, a truck driver named Dale Compton, who made regular runs through West Virginia, started bringing gifts, candy bars, a stuffed animal, a bracelet with plastic beads. Evangeline would accept them on Rachel's behalf, thanking Dale with a smile that never reached her eyes, putting the gifts on Rachel's dresser, where they piled up like offerings at a shrine to something Rachel didn't understand. Then came the night in August of 1986 when everything changed. Rachel was 11 years old, 4 months from her 12th birthday. Evangeline woke her at 900, unusually late for the early bedtime she'd been enforcing. Dale was downstairs, Evangeline explained, and he wanted to give Rachel her birthday present early because he'd be on the road when her actual birthday came. Rachel went downstairs in her nightgown, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Dale sat on the couch, a large man with a beard and rough hands. Thomas was asleep in his recliner as always, the television casting blue light across his face. Evangeline stood by the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, watching. Dale patted the couch beside him. "Come, sit," he said. Rachel looked at Evangeline, who nodded. The gift was a doll, the kind with eyes that opened and closed. Rachel held it awkwardly, too old for dolls, but trained to be grateful. Dale put his arm around her shoulders. His breath smelled like cigarettes and something sweet she couldn't identify. What happened next lasted maybe 20 minutes, though Rachel's memory compressed it into fragments that felt both endless and instant. Dale's hands moving where they shouldn't. Evangeline's voice telling her to be still, to be good. That this was how they kept the electricity on. The rough fabric of the couch against her skin, the doll falling to the floor, its eyes clicking shut. When it was over, Dale left $200 on the kitchen counter. Evangeline took Rachel upstairs, helped her change into clean pajamas, braided her hair with practiced fingers. She explained that what had just happened was normal, that families like theirs had to do hard things to survive, that Rachel was helping in the most important way possible. She said the words matter, of factly, as though describing how to do laundry or make biscuits from scratch. Rachel lay in bed afterward, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a bird. She counted the wooden slats visible through gaps in the wallpaper. 43 slats ran across their bedroom. She counted them over and over until she fell asleep. Dale came back 2 weeks later, then again a month after that. Other men began appearing on the schedule Evangeline kept in a notebook she kept hidden in the kitchen. Rachel learned their names, their habits, the particular requirements each one had. She learned that fighting made things worse, that crying annoyed Evangeline, that disappearing into her own head was the only escape available. By the time Rachel turned 12 in December of 1986, she had been with 7 different men. Evangeline kept careful records of payments received, noting amounts and dates in her neat handwriting. The money paid their overdue mortgage. It bought groceries and kept the propane tank filled through winter. It purchased new school clothes for Rachel, who wore them to the elementary school, where teachers never noticed the way she'd started flinching when adults touched her shoulder, or how she'd stopped making eye contact. Thomas never woke up during these transactions, or perhaps he did wake up and chose not to see, which Rachel later understood was worse than not knowing. Curtis came home occasionally, staying a night or two before disappearing again. He never asked questions about the men who visited or the new television that appeared in the living room, or why Rachel had stopped talking at the dinner table. The isolation of their valley, 12 miles from town down a road that became impassable in heavy rain, meant no unexpected visitors, no neighbors dropping by, no one to witness what was happening inside that house where a 20-year-old woman had decided her 11-year-old sister was a resource to be used, and where a child learned that family could mean something infinitely darker than she'd ever imagined. The network expanded in 1987 through a man named Vernon Tackett, a 51-year-old dispatcher for a regional trucking company based in Bluefield. Tackett had connections throughout southern West Virginia and southwestern Virginia, men who drove long routes and had money to spend during their overnight stops. He approached Evangeline at a gas station in Welch, where she worked part-time pumping gas and cleaning windshields. Some versions of the story portray him as a man with a questionable past, the kind people whispered about, but never openly confronted. He recognized something in Evangeline that most people missed, a calculated coldness that marked her as someone willing to make deals others wouldn't consider. They talked in his truck for 30 minutes. Tackett explained he knew men who would pay high prices for access to young girls in private locations. He said he could arrange regular appointments, handle the scheduling, take a percentage for his organizational services. Evangeline listened without expression, then named her price. $400 per visit, half for her, half for Tackett. He countered with $300. They settled on $350. Within 2 months, Rachel was seeing men 3 or 4 times a week instead of the sporadic visits that had characterized the first year. Tackett kept a list in a small black notebook, calling Evangeline from payphones to arrange times when Thomas would be working or unconscious. The men came from counties across the region, some driving 2 hours for appointments that Tackett guaranteed would be private and untraceable. Rachel turned 13 in December of 1987. Her body was changing in ways that made the encounters more painful and humiliating. Evangeline provided pads and basic explanations about menstruation with the same clinical detachment she applied to everything else, as though Rachel's physical development was merely another factor to manage in their arrangement. The money allowed Evangeline to buy a used car, a 1979 Plymouth Volare with rust around the wheel wells, but an engine that ran. She started driving to Bluefield on weekends, spending money on clothes and makeup, going to bars where she met men her own age. She would come home late Sunday nights smelling like cigarette smoke and cheap perfume, counting cash before hiding it in a shoebox under her bed. Rachel began cutting herself in the spring of 1988. She used a paring knife from the kitchen, making small, precise lines on her inner thighs where nobody would see them. The physical pain gave her something to control in a life where every other aspect had been decided by her sister. Evangeline discovered the cuts during summer when Rachel wore shorts around the house. She slapped Rachel hard enough to split her lip, called her stupid and attention-seeking, said she was putting at risk everything they'd built. Poop, as though what they had was a legitimate business rather than systematic rape of a child. Rachel started 6th grade that fall at Welch Elementary. She sat in the back of classrooms, completed assignments without raising her hand, ate lunch alone in the cafeteria. Teachers noted she was quiet, but gave her passing grades and moved on to students with more visible problems. The school counselor never called her in for meetings. Nobody recognized the signs of a child being trafficked in her own home. The house itself began to reflect their changed financial circumstances. Evangeline replaced worn furniture, bought a microwave, had the roof repaired where it leaked. To anyone who noticed, it appeared that Thomas had found steady work or that Evangeline had gotten a better job. Rural poverty often kept neighbors from asking too many questions about sudden improvements, understanding that pride and privacy mattered more than curiosity. But Rachel was drowning. She developed elaborate coping mechanisms during the encounters, separating her mind so completely that she could spend entire sessions mentally somewhere else. She would recite state capitals alphabetically, having memorized them from a classroom poster. Montgomery, Juneau, Phoenix, Little Rock. She would count ceiling tiles or floorboards or the number of times certain men cleared their throats. Anything to be somewhere other than in her own body. She tried to tell someone once. Her teacher, Mrs. Patricia Caldwell, kept her after class one day to ask about a decline in her homework quality. Rachel stood beside Mrs. Caldwell's desk, the words forming in her throat like stones. "Bad things happen at home," she managed to say. Mrs. Caldwell patted her hand and said, "Everyone goes through difficult phases. That middle school was hard for all girls, that things would get better." Rachel never tried again. By 1989, Rachel had been with more than 40 different men. She knew their names, their vehicles, which ones were rough, and which ones pretended gentleness made what they were doing acceptable. She knew Evangeline kept a growing stack of cash in the shoebox. Money that represented 3 years of Rachel's childhood converted into currency. She knew her father had to know, had to have some awareness of what was happening under his roof, and that his silence made him involved in ways that hurt worse than the acts themselves. And she knew that if she didn't find a way out, she would eventually stop counting ceiling tiles, because there would be nothing left of her to do the counting. The plan began forming in Rachel's mind during a particularly brutal encounter in February of 1989. She was 14 years old, lying on her bed while a man named Gerald Westbrook, a 63-year-old retired mine foreman from Logan County, finished what he paid $3.50 to do. Evangeline stood in the doorway, as always, arms crossed, counting minutes like a factory supervisor monitoring production quotas. When Westbrook left, Rachel heard him talking with Evangeline downstairs. His voice carried up through the floorboards, asking if Evangeline ever participated in these arrangements herself. Evangeline's laugh was sharp and humorless. She told him she wasn't merchandise, that she was management, and that management didn't work the floor. Something crystallized in Rachel's understanding at that moment. Evangeline saw herself as separate from what was happening, as though organizing Rachel's rape was fundamentally different from committing it herself. This delusion, Rachel realized, might be exploitable. If Evangeline believed she was running a business rather than destroying her sister, then perhaps that business could be turned against her. Rachel started paying attention to details she'd previously tried to ignore. She memorized license plate numbers, noting them in a composition notebook she kept hidden in her school locker. She wrote down dates and times, amounts Evangeline received, conversations she overheard between her sister and Vernon Tackett. She documented everything with the methodical precision of someone building a case, though she had no clear idea yet what she would do with the information. The breakthrough came in April when Curtis returned home after being gone for 6 months. He was 20 years old now, working construction jobs across Kentucky and Tennessee, sending money home occasionally, but mostly avoiding the valley where he'd grown up. He stayed for 3 days, sleeping on the couch, barely speaking to anyone. On his second night home, Rachel found him sitting on the back porch after midnight, smoking a cigarette and staring at the dark outline of mountains against the sky. She sat beside him without speaking. After several minutes, Curtis said he knew what was happening. He said he'd known for years. He said he was sorry he'd never stopped it, that he'd been a coward, that running away had seemed like the only option. Rachel asked him a single question. If she found a way to make it stop, would he help her? Curtis looked at her, then really looked at her for the first time in years. He nodded once. What Rachel proposed was risky enough that Curtis initially refused. She wanted to go to the police, but not in a way that would make her look like a victim seeking rescue. Victims, Rachel had learned, were rarely believed, especially when they came from families like hers. Instead, she would position herself as a concerned citizen, reporting criminal activity, someone with documentation and evidence rather than just accusations. But she needed leverage against Evangeline first. She needed her sister involved in the plan, believing she was still in control while actually walking into a trap. Rachel spent 2 weeks working on Evangeline, planting suggestions so subtle her sister never recognized the manipulation. She mentioned that some of the men seemed nervous lately, worried about getting caught. She said Vernon Tackett had been drinking more, talking carelessly in bars. She wondered aloud whether they should have a backup plan, some way to protect themselves if anyone started asking questions. Evangeline dismissed these concerns initially, confident in the isolation that had protected them for 3 years, but Rachel persisted, adding details designed to trigger her sister's paranoia. She invented a story about seeing a police car parked near Dale Compton's house in Welch. She mentioned that Mrs. Caldwell at school had asked her pointed questions about her home life. None of it was true, but Evangeline didn't know that. The seed took root. Evangeline started talking about building a defense, creating a paper trail that would implicate the men while protecting herself. She began writing down names and addresses, documenting the network in case she needed to trade information for immunity. This was exactly what Rachel wanted, evidence created by Evangeline's own hand. In early May, Rachel suggested they needed one clean transaction on record, something that would prove coercion if authorities ever investigated. They should document a situation where one of the men forced payment, where Evangeline tried to refuse but was threatened. It would be insurance, Rachel explained, proof that they were victims rather than willing participants. Evangeline agreed, too focused on protecting herself to recognize she was being maneuvered. She arranged a meeting with a new client Tackett had referred, someone neither of them had met before. Rachel said she would participate, would help create the documentation they needed. Evangeline believed her. What Evangeline didn't know was that Curtis had already contacted Deputy Vernon Kessler at the McDowell County Sheriff's Office. He'd explained that his sister was being trafficked, that he had evidence, that they needed to set up a controlled situation to catch everyone involved. Kessler, a 20-year veteran with training in child exploitation cases, agreed to wait for Curtis's signal. The trap was set. Rachel just needed her sister to walk into it willingly, believing she was the predator when she'd actually become the prey. The meeting was scheduled for May 18, 1989 at 2:00 in the afternoon. Evangeline had arranged it with a man Tackett claimed was a regional manager for a coal distribution company, someone with money and discretion. The man's name was supposedly Richard Bartlow, though that detail would later prove irrelevant because Richard Bartlow didn't exist. Curtis had invented him during his coordination with Deputy Kessler. Evangeline spent the morning preparing, cleaning the house with unusual thoroughness, changing the sheets on Rachel's bed, setting out the notebook where she documented names and transactions. She told Rachel to shower and dress nicely, that this client was important and could lead to more lucrative arrangements. Her voice carried an edge of excitement, the prospect of expanding their operation making her almost animated. Rachel moved through these preparations mechanically, her mind focused on the sequence of events she and Curtis had rehearsed. She would let the encounter begin as normal, wait for Evangeline to accept payment, then signal Curtis, who would be waiting outside. Curtis would call Deputy Kessler from the pay phone at the gas station 2 miles down the road. Timing was critical. Too early and they wouldn't have evidence of transaction. Too late and Rachel would have to endure more than necessary. At 19:45, a truck pulled up the gravel driveway. Evangeline looked out the window and frowned. The vehicle was marked with McDowell County official plates, not the unmarked truck she'd been expecting. Before she could process this discrepancy, Deputy Kessler was at the door with 2 other officers. Evangeline's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, recognition, then calculation. She opened the door, wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, asking how she could help them. Kessler identified himself and said they'd received reports of suspicious activity at the residence. He asked if they could come inside to ask some questions. Thomas was at work. Curtis had made certain of that by calling the mine that morning with a fake emergency that required Thomas's immediate attention in town. Rachel stood in the living room, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might be visible through her shirt. This was the moment everything could fall apart, where Evangeline's quick thinking might find a way to deflect or delay. But Rachel had prepared for this. She'd placed her composition notebook on the coffee table that morning, open to a page listing dates and names. Kessler's eyes went to it immediately. He asked Evangeline what the notebook contained. Evangeline said it was personal, reach for it, but Kessler was faster. He read silently for 30 seconds. When he looked up, his expression had changed from routine investigation to focused intensity. He asked Rachel directly if the information in the notebook was accurate. Rachel nodded. He asked if the men listed had paid money for access to her. Rachel nodded again. Evangeline started talking then, her words coming fast and defensive. She said Rachel was troubled, that she made up stories for attention, that the notebook was fantasy. But Kessler had seen enough cases like this to recognize truth when it was documented so carefully. He asked Evangeline to step outside with the other officers while he spoke with Rachel privately. The interview lasted 40 minutes. Kessler recorded everything on a tape recorder he'd brought, asking Rachel to describe what had been happening, how long it had continued, who was involved. Rachel answered in a flat, emotionless voice, reciting facts like she was reading from a textbook. She gave names, dates, amounts. She explained Evangeline's role in organizing everything. Vernon Tackett's function as coordinator, her father's willful blindness. When Kessler asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, Rachel said she tried once with her teacher and hadn't been believed. She said she had learned that the only way to make adults listen was to present evidence they couldn't ignore, to control the narrative before someone else controlled it for her. Kessler later told Curtis that he'd never interviewed a 14-year-old with that level of strategic thinking, that most trafficking victims required extensive support before they could put into words what had happened to them. Outside, Evangeline was telling the other officers that her sister was mentally unstable, that she'd been planning to get Rachel professional help, that this was all a misunderstanding. One of the officers asked about the shoebox under her bed containing $17,000 in cash. Evangeline said it was savings from her gas station job. The officer asked if she had pay stubs or tax records documenting that income. Evangeline went quiet. By 400, Evangeline was in handcuffs in the back of a patrol car. Kessler had called social services and arranged for Rachel to be placed in emergency protective custody. Curtis arrived as they were preparing to transport Evangeline to the county jail. He hugged Rachel for the first time in years, told her she was brave, promised he wouldn't disappear again. Evangeline stared at them through the patrol car window, her face twisted with an expression Rachel had never seen before. Not anger or fear, but something closer to betrayal, as though Rachel had violated some unspoken agreement by refusing to remain merchandise. In that moment, Rachel understood that her sister had never seen her as human, only as a resource, and that no amount of shared blood or childhood history could bridge that fundamental failure of empathy. The car pulled away down the gravel road, carrying Evangeline toward consequences she'd spent 3 years believing she was too smart to face. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Deputy Kessler turned Rachel's notebook over to state investigators, who began cross-referencing names with vehicle registrations and employment records. Within 72 hours, they'd identified 19 men across 4 counties. Vernon Tackett was arrested at his home in Bluefield on May 21st, found burning papers in a barrel behind his house when officers arrived. The partially destroyed documents included appointment schedules and payment records that supported everything in Rachel's notebook. Tackett made the critical mistake of trying to negotiate. The story claims he hinted at other troubling situations in surrounding counties, though nothing was ever confirmed. The story claims he hinted at a wider circle of men scattered across nearby regions, the kind of network people only mention behind closed doors. In exchange for this cooperation, he wanted immunity. The prosecutors refused, but the story claims investigators used his statements to explore other troubling possibilities in nearby areas, though no clear conclusions were ever reached. Tackett's small black notebook recovered from his truck contained 47 names. 23 of those men were arrested within 6 months. Rachel was placed with a foster family in Charleston, 3 hours away from Welch. The distance was deliberate, designed to separate her from the community where her exploitation had occurred and from potential retaliation by men facing prosecution. Her foster parents, Martin and Joyce Harris, were experienced with traumatized children, having fostered for 15 years. The Harris home had rules Rachel had never experienced. Bedroom doors that locked from the inside, meals at regular times, therapy appointments twice a week with a psychologist who specialized in childhood sexual trauma. Joyce explained these structures gently, understanding that normal would feel foreign to a girl who'd spent 3 years living in calculated horror. Rachel barely spoke for the first month. She attended the therapy sessions in silence, answering direct questions with single words, but offering nothing voluntarily. The psychologist, Dr. Ellen Marowitz, didn't push. She'd worked with enough trafficking survivors to know that trust couldn't be rushed, that Rachel would talk when she felt safe enough to believe her words wouldn't be used against her. Thomas Holloway was arrested in June after investigators determined he'd known about the abuse and failed to intervene. He claimed ignorance initially, said he'd been working long hours and drinking heavily, that he'd had no idea what Evangeline was doing. But neighbors testified they'd seen strange vehicles at odd hours for years. The mine supervisor confirmed Thomas had been working reduced shifts due to his back problems, meaning he was home far more than he claimed. The breaking point in Thomas's story came when investigators found his work schedules from the past 3 years. They showed he'd been home during at least 30 of the documented encounters in Rachel's notebook. His defense collapsed. He accepted a plea agreement for child endangerment and failure to report, receiving 8 years in prison. He died of a heart attack 4 years into his sentence, never having spoken to Rachel again after his arrest. Curtis testified at multiple trials throughout the summer and fall of 1989. He described what he'd witnessed growing up in that house, the gradual erosion of any pretense of normal family life, his own cowardice in running away rather than reporting what he knew was happening. Defense attorneys tried to discredit him as an unreliable witness with a criminal record for minor drug possession. The juries didn't care. Curtis's guilt and obvious pain made him more credible, not less. Evangeline's trial began in October. She was 23 years old, facing 47 counts of child sex trafficking, exploitation, and conspiracy. Her defense attorney argued she'd been coerced by Vernon Tackett, that she was also a victim of the circumstances that had trapped their family in poverty. The prosecution presented the notebook where Evangeline had documented payments in her own handwriting, showing calculations and planning that demonstrated clear intent and organization. Rachel testified for 6 hours over 2 days. She sat in the witness box wearing clothes Joyce had bought her, answered questions in the same flat, emotionless voice she'd used with Deputy Kessler. She described the first time Evangeline had brought Dale Compton upstairs, the progression of abuse over 3 years, her sister's systematic expansion of the operation through Vernon Tackett's network. She never cried. She never raised her voice. She simply recited facts. When the defense attorney asked if she loved her sister, Rachel paused for the first time. She looked directly at Evangeline, who sat at the defense table staring at the floor. Rachel said she used to love her sister back when Evangeline had braided her hair and packed her lunches after their mother died. But that sister had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by someone Rachel didn't recognize. Someone who decided a child's body was currency to be traded for furniture and car payments. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. They found Evangeline guilty on all counts. At sentencing 3 weeks later, the judge called it one of the most terrible cases of sibling betrayal he'd encountered in 30 years on the bench. He sentenced Evangeline to 45 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Evangeline finally looked at Rachel, then across the courtroom, and mouthed words that the court reporter noted in the transcript. "I gave you everything." Rachel stared back without expression, understanding that in Evangeline's twisted logic, she genuinely believed she'd been providing for her sister rather than destroying her. The trials continued through 1990. Dale Compton received 30 years for multiple counts of rape and child exploitation. Gerald Westbrook, the retired mine foreman, got 25 years despite his attorney's arguments about his age and declining health. Prosecutors worked their way through Vernon Tackett's notebook systematically, building cases against men who'd believed their geographic isolation and the poverty of their victims would protect them indefinitely. Rachel watched some of the trials from the gallery, sitting beside Joyce Harris, while men she'd been forced to memorize took the stand in their own defense. They claimed they'd been misled about her age, that Evangeline had assured them Rachel was 18. They said they'd believed it was consensual, that Rachel had seemed willing. Their lawyers painted her as a troubled teenager who'd participated voluntarily and only cried victim when facing consequences. The jury saw through these arguments. Rachel's testimony was too detailed, too consistent across multiple trials, documented in a notebook written years before any arrests. The medical evidence supported her accounts. Psychologist evaluations confirmed trauma patterns consistent with prolonged sexual abuse. Every defense strategy crumbled against the weight of evidence Rachel had carefully compiled. But the emotional toll was devastating. Rachel started having nightmares in August of 1990, waking up screaming in the Harris home, convinced she was back in her bedroom in that valley with Evangeline standing in the doorway counting minutes. Joyce would sit with her until dawn, not offering false comfort, but simply being present while Rachel's mind processed trauma her body had survived. But her mind hadn't yet accepted. Marowitz explained that testifying had forced Rachel to relive events she'd trained herself to separate from during the actual abuse. For 3 years, Rachel had perfected the art of being somewhere else mentally while her body endured violation. Now she was being required to be fully present in those memories, to describe them in clinical detail to rooms full of strangers, to watch as men who'd hurt her tried to rewrite history. Rachel began cutting again in September. Joyce discovered the marks on her arms during laundry. Thin, precise lines that had become Rachel's only method of asserting control. Instead of punishment or lectures, Joyce took her to Dr. Marowitz for an emergency session. They discussed healthier coping mechanisms, ways to process pain without inflicting more of it. Rachel agreed to try, but made no promises. Curtis visited twice a month, driving from whatever construction site he was working to spend weekends in Charleston. He and Rachel didn't talk much during these visits. They'd sit on the Harris' back porch, Curtis smoking cigarettes while Rachel stared at the tree line behind the house. The silence between them held more weight than conversation could carry, a shared understanding of what they'd both survived and failed to prevent. In October, Curtis asked Rachel if she blamed him for running away. Rachel considered the question for several minutes before answering. She said she'd been angry at first back when she was 12 and realized he knew what was happening. But she'd come to understand that he'd been a victim too. That expecting a 16-year-old boy to fight a system designed to exploit them both was unrealistic. She said she didn't blame him anymore. That blame belonged entirely to the adults who'd chosen to participate in or enable her abuse. The conversation shifted something in their relationship. Curtis started opening up about his own guilt. The years he'd spent running from the knowledge of what Evangeline was doing, the drinking and drugs he'd used to numb the shame of his inaction. He told Rachel about the night he'd finally contacted Deputy Kessler, how terrified he'd been that the plan would fail and make things worse for her. Rachel reached over and squeezed his hand, the first voluntary physical contact she'd initiated with anyone since her arrest. School became Rachel's refuge. She enrolled at Capitol High School in Charleston for her freshman year, a large urban school where nobody knew her history. She kept her head down, completed assignments with careful precision, joined no clubs or social groups. Teachers noted she was exceptionally bright but isolated, spending lunch periods in the library reading books about psychology and criminal justice. One teacher, Mrs. Helen Vargas, pulled her aside in December to ask if everything was okay at home. Was that her foster family was kind, that she just preferred solitude to socialization? Mrs. Vargas didn't push, but she made a point to check in weekly, offering her classroom as a quiet space during free periods. These small gestures of concern, without pity or excessive curiosity, meant more to Rachel than elaborate interventions ever could. The final trial ended in March of 1991. 41 men had been prosecuted. 37 were convicted, receiving sentences ranging from 15 to 35 years. 4 were acquitted due to insufficient evidence connecting them specifically to Rachel, though investigators believed they'd been part of the network. Vernon Tackett's information had exposed operations in 6 other families, leading to additional prosecutions that extended beyond Rachel's direct experience. Rachel was 15 years old when it all ended, when the last guilty verdict was read, and she no longer had to testify or relive or explain. Joyce threw a small celebration at home. Nothing elaborate, just acknowledgement that an ordeal was over. Rachel sat at the kitchen table eating cake she couldn't taste, understanding that legal justice and personal healing were entirely separate journeys and that hers was just beginning. Rachel attempted suicide in June of 1991, 3 months after the trials ended. She swallowed 30 sleeping pills from Joyce's medicine cabinet, leaving a note that simply said she was tired of counting. Joyce found her within an hour, rushed her to Charleston Area Medical Center, where doctors pumped her stomach, and admitted her to psychiatric evaluation. The mandatory 72-hour hold extended to 2 weeks. Rachel spent those days in a locked ward, attending group therapy with other teenagers whose trauma showed differently, but hurt just as deeply. A girl named Melissa had survived a car accident that killed her parents. A boy named Devon had been beaten by his stepfather for years. They shared stories without judgment, united by the understanding that survival sometimes felt harder than the alternative. Dr. Marowitz visited daily, working with Rachel to identify the specific triggers that had pushed her toward that decision. Rachel explained she'd started having intrusive thoughts about the men from the trials. wondering if they thought about her in their prison cells, if they blamed her for their convictions, if hatred was better than the indifference Evangeline had shown. The counting reference in her note related to her childhood coping mechanism, the way she'd counted ceiling tiles during abuse. She said she couldn't stop counting things now that her brain had learned to separate so thoroughly she sometimes lost entire hours to the compulsion. The psychiatric team diagnosed her with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and obsessive-compulsive tendencies developed as trauma responses. They adjusted her medications, taught her grounding techniques for when separation threatened, established a safety plan for managing suicidal thoughts. Rachel was released with requirements for intensive outpatient therapy 3 times weekly. Joyce and Martin modified their home routines to support Rachel's recovery. They removed all medications from accessible areas, installed additional locks on Rachel's bedroom door so she controlled who entered her space, created a crisis protocol if she felt unsafe. Martin built her a bookshelf for her growing collection of psychology texts, understanding that knowledge was Rachel's way of processing what had happened to her. Curtis moved to Charleston in August, taking a mechanic job at a local garage so he could be closer. He rented an apartment 15 minutes from the Harris home, visiting twice a week for dinners that gradually became less awkward as they learned to be siblings without the weight of shared trauma crushing every conversation. Rachel returned to Capitol High for her sophomore year, carrying the knowledge that survival required daily choice, that healing wasn't linear, that some days simply making it to bedtime counted as victory. She'd learned that trauma didn't define her, but had fundamentally altered who she might have become, and that accepting this reality was harder than fighting it. Rachel graduated from Capitol High School in 1994 with a 3.8 grade average and acceptance letters from 4 universities. She chose West Virginia University in Morgantown, far enough from Charleston to feel like independence, but close enough that Curtis could visit. Joyce and Martin attended her graduation, sitting in the auditorium while Rachel walked across the stage to receive her diploma. The first person in her family to finish high school, Evangeline sent a letter that summer from the Federal Correctional Institution where she was serving her sentence. The envelope arrived at the Harris home with Rachel's name written in handwriting she recognized immediately. Joyce asked if she wanted to open it or throw it away unopened. Rachel chose to read it, needing to know what her sister could possibly have to say after 5 years of silence. The letter contained no apology. Instead, Evangeline wrote about prison conditions, her cellmate who snored, the limited library selection. She mentioned that several other women in the facility were serving time for similar charges, that they'd formed a support group for mothers and sisters who'd been prosecuted for protecting their families the only way poverty allowed. She asked Rachel to visit, said they needed to reconcile before too much time passed, that family was supposed to forgive. Rachel burned the letter in the Harris fireplace and never responded. Dr. Marowitz helped her process the rage that surfaced. The way Evangeline still refused accountability, still framed systematic child trafficking as economic necessity. Rachel wrote her own letter that she never sent, pages of everything she'd wanted to say in court, but couldn't put into words at 15. She described what counting ceiling tiles felt like, what it meant to have your sister trade your body for appliances, what kind of person could watch a child be raped and call it family contribution. She sealed it in an envelope and kept it in her desk drawer. Proof that her voice existed, even if Evangeline never heard it. University offered Rachel anonymity she'd never experienced. Nobody in Morgantown knew her history unless she chose to share it. She majored in social work, driven by the memory of failed systems that had let her fall through every possible crack. She studied child welfare policy, trauma-informed care, the indicators professionals should recognize but often miss. She became the expert she'd needed when she was 11 years old and no adult could see past her sister's performance of normal. She met David Brennan in a psychology class during her junior year. He was studying to become a school counselor, passionate about reaching kids who struggled in traditional educational environments. They studied together at the library, their conversations gradually shifting from academic topics to personal histories. Rachel told him everything on their 4th date, watching his face for the disgust or pity she'd learned to expect. Instead, he reached across the table and held her hand, said her past didn't define her, that surviving made her stronger, not broken. Rachel graduated from West Virginia University in 1998 and took a position with Child Protective Services in Kanawha County. She was 23 years old, assigned to investigate reports of abuse and neglect in families that reminded her uncomfortably of her own. She visited homes at the end of unmarked roads, talked to children who'd learned to hide truth behind polite answers, recognized the signs other social workers dismissed as poverty rather than exploitation. In her first year, she identified 3 trafficking situations that more experienced workers had classified as behavioral problems or family dysfunction. She documented evidence carefully, built cases that couldn't be ignored, ensured children were removed before harm escalated. Her supervisor noted she had an unusual instinct for recognizing hidden abuse, never suspecting that instinct came from lived experience rather than professional training. Rachel married David in 2000, a small ceremony attended by Curtis, Joyce, Martin, and a handful of university friends. She wore a pale blue dress instead of white, unable to associate that color with anything except the cotton dress she'd been forced to wear as a child. They honeymooned in Virginia Beach, spent a week walking along the shore while Rachel tried to imagine a future that didn't revolve around a past. They had a daughter in 2002, naming her Grace after the imaginary friend Rachel had created during her worst years. Holding Grace in the hospital, Rachel made promises about protection and autonomy and unconditional love that she knew her own mother had failed to honor. David understood without being told that Rachel would be a fiercely protective parent, that certain boundaries would be absolute, that their home would be sanctuary rather than the site of trauma. Curtis started his own auto repair business in 2005, finally stable after years of struggling with employment and sobriety. He and Rachel met for lunch monthly, their conversations easier now that enough time had passed to allow them to remember good moments from before everything fractured. They talked about their mother sometimes, constructing memories from fragments too distant to verify, imagining what she might have prevented if she'd lived. Evangeline was denied parole in 2014 after serving 25 years. The parole board reviewed Rachel's victim impact statement submitted in writing because Rachel refused to attend the hearing. She wrote that her sister had never acknowledged responsibility, never expressed genuine remorse, never demonstrated understanding of the lifelong damage she'd inflicted. Evangeline would serve her full 5-year sentence, eligible for release in 2034 at age 68. Now at 49 years old, Rachel directs a non-profit organization focused on trafficking prevention in rural Appalachia. She trains law enforcement, educates communities, provides resources for survivors. She carries the weight of 41 men who paid to abuse her. But she also carries the knowledge that her testimony put them in prison and her advocacy has protected countless children from similar fates. The valley outside Welch, where she grew up, sits empty now. The house demolished years ago. The land reclaimed by vegetation and silence. Rachel has never returned. Some places hold too much darkness to ever be cleansed, and some memories are better honored through distance than confrontation. If Rachel's story has reminded you that evil often wears familiar faces, that family can be the most dangerous word in a child's vocabulary, then honor her survival by clicking the like button and subscribing. Share this story with someone who works with children, who volunteers in communities, who has the power to notice what others ignore. Drop a comment telling us you'll pay attention, that you'll ask the uncomfortable questions, that you'll believe children when they find the courage to speak. This story reminds us that survival often begins the moment silence breaks. Let it reach every corner where someone might be waiting to be seen.